All right, over the past couple of days, we've been talking about disadvantages and advantages of either asexual or sexual reproduction. And we did discuss already the advantages to sexual reproduction. Let's talk about the disadvantages to asexual reproduction. Now, it turns out there are actually very few disadvantages. That doesn't mean they're not significant, but there aren't that many of them. So the first of them is that asexual reproduction is slower in terms of the evolutionary change that can occur on a generation-to-generation basis. What I mean by this is that the only way that you can have a change that will lead to adaptations and changes in the morphology of the organism, in this case, is if there's a mutation. And don't forget that the process of DNA replication and then the mitosis that would occur to lead to the reproduction are pretty robust things. Mistakes are very rarely made. So from one generation to the next, say of a bacterium, it's very unlikely that you're going to have a change in the genetic makeup of that organism in that population from one generation to the next. The other disadvantage to asexual reproduction is that the lack of variability means that if there's a sudden change in the environment, it might lead to the extinction of those organisms and that particular set of genes. And what you're going to come to find is that really we need to focus in on less the individual, but the genes that that individual carries. And so if you have an extinction event and it wipes out all those genes, that's a huge problem. It's not a huge problem for the population, it's a huge problem for the genes. I know that sounds like a strange thing, but you'll understand that more as we begin to get into the concept of evolution. So that's it. Those are the disadvantages of asexual reproduction. Now, there aren't many, but they're actually kind of substantial. So let's take a look at sexual reproduction. And don't forget that sexual reproduction fundamentally results in offspring that are genetically different from the parental organisms. So let's think about what the advantages to sexual reproduction are. And you're going to quickly see that they're essentially the corollaries to all the disadvantages of asexual reproduction. It all has to do with the variability. So the first one is that the variability allows for having a greater chance of success in a changing environment. And when I say the environment, I don't just mean the environment, sort of the abiotic forces, but that also means the other organisms that surround that population or that individual. And most importantly, the idea of competition that exists for limited resources between yourself and the other individuals that might have a slight difference that makes them be able to outcompete you, or maybe you can outcompete them. What you should keep in mind is that in the macroscopic world, the environment and the competition is constantly changing. So having the ability to change at least a couple of your genes might be a huge advantage. Now, there's also the huge problem in that you might actually change yourself into something that's not going to work in a environment that doesn't change. So you are taking your chance. You're playing a little bit of a game here in terms of what your strategy should be. The second component, the second advantage, is that there's a faster evolutionary rate on a generation-to-generation basis. Again, just to reinforce this concept, since an asexually reproducing organism must rely on mutations in order to have a new set of genes that might confer an advantage. In the case of the sexually reproducing organisms, mixing things up and shuffling genes may allow there to be a change that leads to the adaptation of a new characteristic or a new behavior within one generation. So you don't have to rely on mutations alone in order for there to be some combination of genes that would confer a benefit to that individual. Now, there also is one more advantage, but it's pretty bogus, and I'm going to put it in brackets here because it's actually a fairly rare thing. It's only seemingly important when you think about human beings and primates and other large vertebrates, which is that potentially, and this is only potentially, there are two parents to watch over offspring. Again, this is a fairly rare thing, so that's why I'm going to put it in brackets. And the other thing you should keep in mind here is that, frankly, an organism that's pretty simple, like a bacterium, doesn't even need to offer parental care. So whether there's one parent or two parents, it really doesn't make a difference, because as soon as the offspring of that bacterium is created, it's a perfectly viable offspring. It can go off and do everything that the adult bacterium did. And frankly, there's no such thing as an adult versus a baby bacterium. They're all the same in terms of their abilities. Now, the interesting thing are the disadvantage of sexual reproduction, and there are lots of disadvantages, as you found out through your screencasts that you folks made about the courtship. All right, so I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, and hopefully you'll just be able to write them down. And none of these are so hard to understand that I'm going to have to take too much time to explain. So the first one is that in a sexually reproducing organism, you need to find a mate, and you also risk having non-specific mating events, meaning that you would mate with something that's not your own species, which would be totally inviable and a waste of your energy and time. The second one is that you must have male and female individuals in a population. Sorry, I might have cut that off. If you didn't hear it, then I'm going to write it down. The third one is that there's more of a chance of having genetic mishaps with the process of meiosis, mishaps that are deadly. And of course, you all saw that with the last couple of screencasts where I was talking about the chromosomal abnormalities and the syndromes that come about as a result of having non-disjunction events. Next one is that the offspring that are produced may be genetic dead ends, which means that they either have a poor set of genes and therefore can't reproduce themselves, or they themselves have problems finding a mate, and therefore, boom, all your genes basically die with that offspring. Okay, and the next one is that it takes a lot more energy to reproduce, and that process can be life-threatening, as you either started to see or will see in the films that I'm going to be showing you. Okay, sometimes there is a large post-birth parental investment. I mean, you think about this in terms of human beings. The child will be with the parents for a long period of time before they can actually go off and be on their own and take care of themselves. In a sense, this is like a parasitic relationship, because it takes away from the ability of the parents to be able to take care of themselves and focus on their own, say, nourishment and well-being. Okay, there are two more. The next one is that there is a huge input or need for energy to be put towards expensive reproductive systems. And then finally, the biggest loss of them all is that only 50% of the individual's genes are passed on to the next generation. And it's worth it for me to take a moment to pause and think about this for a moment. If you consider yourself and your body to simply be survival machines for your genes, you'll understand the concept of evolution and competition and asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction much better. Because when you think about it, the only reason that I'm able to survive and be Darren Chang, or you're able to survive and be who you are, is because your genes are a good enough design and create you so that you can survive long enough to be attractive enough to find a mate and reproduce and pass those genes on to the next generation. And really what you're trying to do is maximize the number of genes that you can pass on to the next generation. And so what do? You find a mate that you think will actually allow you to have offspring that will have even more success than you might have had you been able to reproduce asexually. Now, I know that sounds very odd, because obviously we don't have that option, but it's ultimately the fundamental reason why sexual reproduction came into play and why it evolved in the first place, because it became better, probabilistically, to have only 50% of your genes move on to the next generation rather than taking a chance of having 0% of your genes move on to the next generation if you reproduce through mitosis or in a way of cloning. Because if you clone yourself, you're able to reproduce asexually and clone yourself, then it may be that you go into the next generation, which has a very different environment, and you can't survive and you can't reproduce, and boom, that means 100% of your genes are completely lost forever. Whereas if you undergo sexual reproduction, at least you have a better chance, if there are changes that might occur in the next generation, that 50% of the genes that you don't have, but that your partner has, your mate would have, those 50% might actually confer a higher success rate, and therefore you'd be able to survive and reproduce and pass those genes on. Now, of course, it does mean that your genes start to become more and more diluted. So it becomes a very selfish process in the end. As you will see, when it comes to organisms, the number one goal of all organisms is to basically eat enough, survive long enough to have sex and reproduce so that you can pass as many genes as you can on to the next generation and generations thereafter. Obviously, not a very romantic view. All right, I just want to talk about a couple more things in here, and these are things that are seen incorrectly as being advantages to sexual reproduction. The first thing is that adaptations, which are beneficial characteristics or behaviors, spread more quickly through a population in sexually reproducing organisms. That is not true because ultimately, since sexually reproducing organisms take a long time to reproduce, then it takes a long time for the next generation to tick over and have those new adaptations be then carried to the next generation and the next generation. So in terms of time, it actually may take a lot more time for sexually reproducing organisms for them to be able to spread good positive characteristics and behaviors through the population. Whereas in the case of bacteria that are undergoing asexual reproduction, if a good mutation pops up very quickly in terms of overall time, it doesn't take much time for that to spread through the population. Now, it may be that it has to go through many generations to do that, but given that a bacterium can reproduce in 20 minutes, you can imagine that in a given day, you can have a pretty significant evolutionary change. Another incorrect assumption is that asexual reproduction does not allow for evolution and adaptation. And conversely, that sexual reproduction leads to faster evolution and adaptation. Just like I said moments ago, asexual reproduction does allow for evolution in that if there are mutations, evolution will potentially occur if it's a beneficial mutation. Or even if it's not a beneficial mutation, then that organism will disappear and those genes will forever disappear. And that also is an evolutionary event, as we will come to find out. Thirdly, organisms that reproduce asexually are better suited to their environment, and that's not always the case, that sometimes a sexually reproducing organism will be better suited to their environment, and we'll talk more about that in the future. And then lastly, that sexually reproducing organisms always outcompete asexually reproducing organisms. That is so fundamentally false that it's actually probably more close to the truth to have that in reverse, that asexually reproducing organisms do better than sexually reproducing organisms if we just look at it in terms of populations that are dominating Earth. Okay, bye.